The people of Medina remembered for a long time afterwards how Umar looked on that Friday morning when he came out of his house. They would remember always the pain and sadness in his eyes, his drawn face, and his voice moaning, "I hear you, I'm coming," with his hands to his ears, as if he were calling the azan. They stopped in their tracks as he went by. They whispered to one another, asking what terrible thing could have befallen the Caliph. And when someone came out of Umar's house a short time after, they gathered around him, asking for explanations. The man's face was grim as he told them what had happened. That morning, Umar had received the usual mail from the provinces, and there was a letter about a certain governor, he did not care to mention which one, who was in command of an army some distance from his home. They were on a campaign headed east, and had come to the banks of a river in an area which was unfamiliar to them. There were no boats in sight, and there was no way they could judge the depth of the river. The governor had told them to seek out an inhabitant from the nearby village, which they did. They found an old man who could not give them the information they required, so the governor ordered him to get into the water and find out how deep it was. The old man protested, saying he was feeble and not able to stand extreme cold. But the governor insisted, and in the end the old man went into the water. He waded out until the water came up to his waist. Then the current and the cold overwhelmed him, and he began to drown. As he was drowning, he called out, "Umar, Umar, help me, help me." The people felt great sympathy for their caliph. Indeed, this was difficult news for him to bear. No wonder he had been upset. Umar lost no time in issuing a command to the governor in question to report to Medina. The governor arrived in time for prayers and went afterwards to greet Umar. But Umar did not return his greetings. In fact, Umar was so angry that he did not trust himself to speak. It wasn't until the 7th day after the governor arrived that Umar sent for him. "Why did you send that man into the water to drown?" asked Umar, his face white and taut. "I did not intend he should drown," explained the governor. "I beg you to consider the circumstances. There was no boat, and no means of discovering the depth of the river. None of us knew the terrain, the currents of the probable depth, and it was imperative that we reach the other side in order to begin our siege before nightfall. It is usual practice to ask local inhabitants for help in such situations. I sent out for a villager, and this man was brought to me." Umar turned suddenly. "An old man, a feeble old man who told you he could not survive the cold water." "That's right," said the governor, "and neither would my men have survived. It is customary in times of war to sacrifice one man for the sake of many. Would you weigh the life of an old man soon to die against an army of the faithful? May I remind you, Amir al-Mu'minin, that we have conquered city after city, territory after territory." Omar was beside himself. "Would you like to know how I would have it? I would have you killed as a punishment. If it were not for setting a precedent, indeed. Who are the cities and the riches and the territories for? They are for the Muslim people, for the old men and the families and the poor, as well as the soldiers and the statesmen. It is the ordinary Muslim like the old man who cried out for me in his final agony that I care about. I order you, therefore, to compensate the old man's family and to get out of my sight. Never do I want to see your face around here again."
وما كان لمؤمن أن يقتل مؤمنا إلا خطأ.
Never should a believer kill a believer, but if it happens by mistake, compensation is due. At the governor's departure, Umar buried his head in his hands and prayed that Allah would forgive him for the mistakes and sins committed by the men under his rule.